Hi, morning, y'all. We're going to continue today with our North America theme, but now we're going to start getting into individual countries instead of the whole continent, essentially. So we're going to cover my favorite country, Cuba. So with no further ado, let's start the slideshow. Slide. Okay. So the geography and the history of Cuba. Things highlighted in yellow and will help you with your answers. They're important. Skip that part. So the objectives for you students is that you will learn where and what Cuba is. You'll be able to explain why Cuba has a communist government and examine the US of A's embargo against Cuba, our country's embargo against Cuba. So these are questions that you're gonna have to answer. What's the largest city in Cuba? We'll learn that as we go. Why did the Cuban government choose communism? And what's an embargo, and why does the United States have one against Cuba? So some stuff to know beforehand. Reconcile means to restore friendly relations. It's like making up. If you and your friend fight and you guys are getting along now, you reconciled. Orchestrated, arrange or direct the elements of a situation. If you're in control of a situation, you're the one who orchestrated it. If you make something happen, you orchestrated it happening. And then the embargo, which is important because you'll need to know that. Well, they're all important, but this one especially. The partial or complete prohibition of commerce and trade with a particular country. So it's when you stop trading with a country. So here's a little picture of the beach in Cuba. After discovering the island, Christopher Columbus claims that Cuba is the most beautiful earth that human eyes have ever seen. Here's where Cuba is on a map. East of Mexico, south of Florida, north of Colombia and Bolivia. Colombia and Venezuela, I think. Can't even remember. Where the Caribbean Sea, which is this area, meets the Atlantic Ocean, this big area, roughly 100 miles off the coast of Florida. That's what Cuba looks like. In the end, it's got tons of little islands right over here and over here and over here. So Cuba is made up of over 4,000 small islands, keys, and archipelagos. A key is a small island just made out of sand, so there's not much on it. And then an archipelago is a bunch of small islands in a sea, so something like this would be an archipelago. Tons of islands. Mountains. Cuba has 3 main mountain ranges: the Sierra del Rosario, the Sierra Maestra, and the Escambray Mountains. Cuba is known for having some of the strongest coffee in the world. This is a guy doing tobacco, so the quality of Cuban tobacco is said to be amongst the finest in the world. That's why Cuban cigars are so popular. The climate of Cuba is ideal for the production of sugar, tobacco, and coffee. And although sugar, tobacco, and coffee used to be the major sectors of Cuba's economy, they only now account for 10% of the GDP, gross domestic product, and 20% of the workforce. So it used to be 90%, if not more, but now it's much less because of automation and industrialization, kind of. The economy of Cuba is largely a planned economy dominated by state-run enterprises. The government of Cuba owns and operates most industries, and most of the labor force is employed by the state because it's a communist government. So most people who have jobs in Cuba are employed by the state, or they're self-employed, or they work in collectives. So investment is restricted and requires approval by the government. So if I liked a Cuban business idea and I was a millionaire, I couldn't go over to Cuba and give them a bunch of money to help them out. The government, or I couldn't just do it on my own. I would need to get approval from the Cuban government because they're trying to keep foreign influence out of the country. The government sets most prices and rations goods to citizens. So prices aren't set by the market like they are in our country. The government chooses prices. And then they ration goods and say, hey, you get a pound of rice a week or something. So the capital of Cuba is Havana, and it's its largest city. So make sure you remember that. It's 2.3 million people. It's smaller than the Twin Cities metropolitan area, I believe. I think that's about 3 million. The entire population of Cuba is around 11.3 million people. So not too small, not too huge. Cuba currently has a communist government. You got to remember that. Spanish is the official language of the country. It's a Hispanic country. It was colonized by the Spanish in 1492. Cuba remained a Spanish colony until the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was one of the most important colonies to Spain. That's why it stayed in the Spanish Empire for so long. After the Spanish-American War was fought, Cuba was granted independence from Spain, but was forced to accept American influence. So we kind of freed Cuba from Spain, but then just made them do what we say instead of allowing them to actually be free. We made them sign a constitution that supported the United States. It allowed the United States to take Guantanamo Bay, which we still own and operate today, and we lock a bunch of terrorists up there. We were also allowed to dictate Cuba's foreign policy. They couldn't do anything we didn't want them to do with other countries, and we could intervene in their domestic affairs as well. So if we didn't like the way Cuba was being run, we could go in there and change it too. Eventually, they gained full independence. So from 1933 to 1952, they were completely independent. They were just their own country, no American influence. But then in 1952, a Cuban general named Fulgencio Batista overthrew the democratic government of Cuba and installed an authoritarian government backed by the United States. Batista's government was viewed as corrupt and it was disliked amongst the people because he was so evil. Oh shoot, I should have split that into two sentences there. It's quite a run-on sentence, my bad. But Batista ran a brutal government that assassinated political opponents, jailed dissidents, which are people who protest and go to the streets, and tortured those who they considered enemies of the state. They would torture people who they thought were revolutionaries. And all that kind of stuff actually caused a revolution because people won't take that kind of punishment for so long. So eventually things got so bad under Batista that there was a revolution led by a man named Fidel Castro in 1959. Fidel Castro was a revolutionary who had tried to take over Cuba before 1959, but he got exiled to Mexico. And from there, he built a small little army and then conquered Cuba. After Fidel Castro was victorious, the United States became alarmed by his communist ideas and decided to embargo Cuba. They kind of made him become a communist. That's some research that I did in college, was that Fidel Castro wasn't, this guy right here, he wasn't a communist until the United States kept trying to kill him and remove him from power, and then he allied with the communists. So the U.S. attempted to assassinate Castro many times throughout his life. There's a fantastic book about it. They would try to put poisonous pens in his pocket or have scuba diving gear be poisoned against him. They tried to send in like women who would seduce Castro and then kill him. There's a bunch of crazy things that the CIA tried to do for a long time to kill him, and they never succeeded. So they even orchestrated an invasion of Cuba. I mean the CIA and the United States, which was launched by Cuban exiles, people that Fidel Castro had banned from Cuba. But the invasion of Cuba failed, and it became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. And it was a really big disaster for the United States. It drove the Cubans into the hands of the Soviet Union. Fidel felt threatened by the United States. They had just tried to invade him. So he made an alliance with the Soviet Union, who was the United States' arch enemy back then. Now that the Soviet Union has fallen, the United States and Cuba are working towards improving their relations, since the Soviet Union is no longer around to be so scary. So although the Soviet Union no longer exists, Cuba has remained communist to this day, and the embargo against Cuba has also remained in place. Trump has made sure that it's still around. So during the presidency of Obama, the United States made efforts to repair their relationship with Cuba. Obama tried to lift the embargo, but it didn't work out in time. Congress shut it down, and then Trump got elected, and he's decided to abandon Obama's reconciliation efforts, and he's reimposed the travel ban and business sanctions. And I was actually going to go on a vacation to Cuba, but then Trump got elected, and I couldn't go on vacation to Cuba anymore with my college. It was a bummer. So questions to consider: why did the Cubans choose communism? What is an embargo, and why does the United States have one against Cuba? And what role did the United States play in Cuban affairs before the revolution in Cuba? That's the end. So let's get back to this meeting. Okay, so for those of you who are watching, if you want to go through that slide and get the information, it will be in Files, Class Materials, and then I will upload it right now. Let's do desktop, geography stuff, date modify. Okay, so now that slide show will be available in the Files and then Class Materials tab, and then you can go through it on your own. And I will post this video along with the questions shortly. So thanks for watching. Have a good day.